The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission has never been more relevant. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our November virtual Communications Forum Luncheon. Thank you for being with us today. I especially want to thank our luncheon sponsors. This has been a very challenging year for all of us. We've had to adapt here at the Institute by moving our luncheon series online, and we've been gratified by the very positive reaction from our sponsors. We really appreciated your support, and I want to ask you to support us again next year. So please include this luncheon series in your 2021 budget. We're counting on you, our sponsors. Thank you. Next month, we'll wrap up our 2020 season. On December 15th, we'll welcome FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. And that will be a great way to end our year. And I know you'll have a lot of questions for Chairman Pai about what he might see ahead and what next year might look like. So once again, that will be Tuesday, December 15th. Our speaker today is a real media veteran. Pat LaPlatney is the president and co-CEO of Gray Television, which owns and operates stations in 94 television markets. Pat has held that post since January 2019. From 2016 to 2019, Pat served as Chief Operating Officer and then President and CEO of Raycom Media. When Raycom was acquired by Gray in early 2019, Pat became President and co-CEO of Gray. Pat is a member of Gray TV's Board of Directors and also serves on the board of the National Association of Broadcasters. In addition, he's chairman of the NBC Affiliate Board. And for you fans of the Fighting Irish, Pat is a graduate of Notre Dame University. Let me remind our viewers that during Pat's presentation, you'll have a chance to ask questions using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. Just type in your question, send it to us, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after Pat's presentation. He has some fascinating insights to offer on political spending and political ad trends over this last election cycle, so I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Pat LaPlatney.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me today. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Gray Television, we're in the local media business, owning and operating stations and television stations in 95 markets throughout the U.S. We also own production companies and other assets. It's been an interesting year in many ways. Today, we'll look at the political landscape through the lens of media expenditures. Before I jump into the presentation, though, I'm going to read a note from Ad Age with some very fresh information that just came out this morning. Data from Kantar says the 2020 election cycle realized $8.5 billion in ad spend, including $1.8 billion just for the presidential race. That included around $1 billion from Biden, inclusive of the PACs, compared to around $800 million for Trump. Ad Age says Biden was able to outspend Trump during most day parts in key swing states. California was the biggest state by spending due to the competitive House races. A lot more spending this year reportedly ended up on national networks because local spots got so crowded and expensive. Trump's budget was around 40% digital and Biden's was around 25% digital, though they spent similar dollars on the digital side. Local broadcast was roughly 50% of all spending. So with that, first slide is category spending by year from 2012 through 2020. So you've got 3 bars here. I suppose we could have used different colors for those bars, but unfortunately too late for that now. I'll focus first on the bars to the left, the House. If you look down at the bottom of the page, you'll see the House, then presidential, then Senate. So the story, on House spending has been a nice steady increase over the last, 8 years. It started with really a pittance in 2012, roughly 20 million bucks, and it's worked its way up to over $1 billion in 2020. Next up, let's look at Senate, which is on the far right, and you have a pretty similar story there, going from 100 million up to and sort of steadily growing up to $1.7 billion in 2020, which is a remarkable number. And then the presidential story is one that's a little different. There's around $1 billion spent in 12, and then in 16, if you recall, and we'll get into this in a little bit of depth later on, there was a sort of lack of excitement about the candidates, and Trump, used a lot of earned media. So the spending dropped in 16, but if you look at the numbers that we just talked about a second ago, stunningly high in 2020. Some very, very big numbers. Why don't I shut down my notifying tone there and go to the next slide, which is presidential spending by media type. I will start by saying that I wish I had greater historical data on this slide. Certainly would have been interesting to see the numbers from 2016. But here you get a pretty good look at what's going on. So in 2020, you'll see that digital is roughly 28% of the spend. Cable and satellite are essentially the same thing. So that's roughly 15%. You got a sliver for radio in there at 3%, and then broadcast, as we noted, is in the low 50s. So broadcast was a clear winner in 2020 presidential race. If we move on to the next slide, we're gonna focus on this year's situation, looking at what was different, because the numbers were enormous. The Bloomberg effect, which had something to do with that. How early did things start? A look at the really heavy political window, which is October 1 through Election Day. And then we'll start taking a look ahead at 2022 and 2024. So what was different? Unlike 2016, both parties and their allies were united behind their candidates. If you recall, there was a sort of a general lack of support or real interest around both candidates initially in 16. And then neither the DNC or RNC advertised for the candidates, and some big super PACs sat out in 16. So that's why, one of the reasons you saw that lower presidential spending in 2016. In 20, Democratic candidates and allied groups raised huge amounts of money. In fact, Democratic challengers often grossly exceeded the Republicans' campaign numbers or Republican spending numbers substantially. The state of South Carolina comes to mind initially. Democratic groups raised big numbers from low dollar donors as well as dark money groups that were funded by really wealthy folks and anonymous donors. And then Biden outspent Hillary by a 2-to-1 margin. That's a huge factor. The COVID-19 pandemic essentially raised viewership of television, especially in local news. At the same time, the pandemic forced campaigns to alter how they got their message out to voters. So instead of doing rallies and door-to-door canvassing and other, in-person appearances, campaigns turned more to broadcast television. And then finally, spending started much earlier for the 2020 cycle, especially in key Senate races. We'll see a little more on that in a minute. Well, let's talk about Mike Bloomberg. Just a remarkable amount of money that Bloomberg spent in a relatively short period of time. He also, not only did he spend for himself, but he also supported, the Democratic candidates at many levels, spending, roughly $100 million into Florida in the last several weeks of the campaign. He passed on the first 4 primaries, if you recall. So he did not, he didn't compete in Iowa, Nevada, South Carolina, New Hampshire. He focused on Super Tuesday and beyond, and this strategy required him to advertise in over 20 states at once at remarkably high levels. In the beginning of 20, Bloomberg spent more advertising dollars during a 6 to 7 week period than most political advertisers spent the entire cycle, which in some cases, was more longer than a year. At the end of the day, he was one of the top 5 overall political advertisers for Gray. And again, when you consider that, he doesn't get credit for that $100 million he spent in Florida, and he was only active for 6 to 7 weeks, it's all the more amazing. Moving on. So how early did it start? We have never, at Gray, we've never seen spending levels start earlier than we did for the 2020 cycle. In 2016, first orders for the Iowa caucus began in November of 15. For 2020, we actually had an order in February of 2019 from Tom Steyer, who spent a ton of money in South Carolina, and then increased really in earnest beginning in August of 2019. Spending in competitive races began anywhere from 6 to 8 months prior to the election, with some notable exceptions beginning 1 year out or more. In Maine, spending for Susan Collins' race began a full year before the general election. And then in Kentucky, a very interesting situation. We had general election spending for Mitch McConnell and Amy McGrath in the summer of 2019. Over a year before the election and 10 months before McGrath won what turned out to be an extremely competitive Democratic primary. And we're going to take a look now at what is the tightest political window, which where the majority of money gets spent. That's essentially October 1 through Election Day. So usually in that window, you see 50% of the overall spending. This year at Gray, 53% of total political spending through Election Day, came between October 1 and November 3rd. Obviously, the Georgia runoff races will push the fourth quarter percentage higher. Candidates and airwaves absolutely flooded our airwaves, squeezing out most regular core advertisers. The political advertisers waived separation agreements. Usually they don't want to run right next to another political ad, but many of them waived that. They were double spotting, which simply means they ran 2 ads in half-hour local newscasts, which usually it's no more than 1. They did the same in prime time. And really to put some context around that, at Gray, our total core revenue or non-political revenue in October of 20 was roughly $82 million. That same month, our political revenue was $175 million. It's hard for me to put that into context. It's just stunning the size of the political spending in the month of October of 20. And also, we talked about news and prime. Sports was another area, area of heavy focus for candidates and PACs. We had advertisers running 3 spots in a football game, which is again something that we really haven't seen. And as with news, demand drove up candidate lowest unit rates and issue rates to levels we've really never seen before. So let's talk about Georgia for a minute. And I'm located in Atlanta, so I get to see a lot of political ads these days. Actually, I've been watching political ads almost every break now since the beginning of September. So the Republicans currently hold a 50 to 48 advantage in the Senate. So the GOP needs to pick up one of the 2 seats for the runoff, which is actually going to be on January the 5th. I can tell you that the attack ads began the week after Election Day. In fact, Wednesday night after the general election, Raphael Warnock had an ad on that essentially told Georgia television viewers to get ready for all the negative ads that were coming. So literally long before the race or that sort of jungle primary was decided, he was on the air assuming he was going to make the runoff. With ads that, candidly, I've never seen one like that before. Projections for total spending for these two runoffs are starting around $200 million. That's a whole lot of money in the state of Georgia over a relatively short period of time. So during the, prior to the election, so the amount of money spent on broadcast TV for those 2-seat elections the number was roughly 127 million. So the expectation is that there's going to be a lot more than 127 million spent, in a very, roughly 2-month window. Of that 127, 65% was spent in the Atlanta market. That's why I'm seeing so many political ads. There's some out there calling these 2 races to attract more than $1 billion in spending. Personally, I struggle with that number, but again, it's 2020, so anything can happen. As it says here, every thought we've had has been shattered about political spending has been shattered in 2020, and numbers that seemed aggressive last year really have all been exceeded. And the reality is the prize in these Georgia Senate runoffs is very substantial, as you all know. So what lies ahead? I think it's safe to say that the trend of increased political spending is not going to slow down. Early indications are that the Republicans will do what they can to flip the House in 22. I think they were pretty encouraged by what they saw this year. In the Senate, there's going to be a number of competitive races: Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That represents a lot of money. And then, as with this year, there could be other races that sort of bubble up, not unlike South Carolina or some of the other Kansas, like we saw this year. There should be significant spending for the gubernatorial races in 22, because there'll be 36 of them. And so that, again, will represent a large pool of money. Then with Trump not on the ballot, will the Democrats be as motivated as they have been the past few years? I'm guessing the answer is yes. And then we just talked about, I think it's safe to say the Republicans will be as well. And then speaking of Trump, he's already called for challengers to the GOP office holders who he's decided were insufficiently loyal to him, including Governor Kemp here in Georgia, DeWine, and Senator Murkowski in Alaska. He could cause widespread and very, very expensive primary fights all over the country. And I think that's becoming more and more likely. And then finally, in our last slide here, what about 2024? For 24, there's no reason to believe spending won't continue to increase. And again, we're seeing an extraordinarily high level of spending in 2020. We'll get a little bit of read on 24 when we see 22. But again, when you think about 24, it's a good bet that there'll be somebody named Trump running for president in 24. The question is whether it's the president, Don Jr. or Ivanka. Regardless of which one runs, the GOP is likely to be more splintered than ever. And based on the news I saw over the weekend, it's very likely that our current president will run again in 24. There's a lot of Republicans out there. Hope will have a fresh face. Will generate excitement. Spur fundraising and motivate voters to take back the White House. Who that is, we don't know right now. There's also no shortage of Trump loyalists who are likely to explore 2024 run in the cabinet, the Congress, state houses, and even Fox News, Tucker Carlson. It's unclear what happens to their plans, if Trump runs in 2024, which leads to a lot of, a really interesting challenge for the Republican Party over the next 4 years. It's going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before. Except for the last 4 years. So final bullet here, and then we can get to questions. It really just focuses on the Senate, which will have 33 seats up with the Democrats defending more than the Republicans in 2024. So we'll get a read on what the Senate looks like in 22, and then very, very likely it's going to be competitive again in 2024. So with that, that completes my presentation. And Rick, I guess I toss it back to you.
Hey, thank you, Pat. That's a fascinating presentation. My goodness. Just to think that these numbers have just gone off the charts like this. and it must be really amazing for you to sit back and watch all this unfold.
It's been
So thank you
remarkable.
very much for a very, very enlightening presentation. So now we'll turn to our questions and answers, and I would invite our viewers to keep sending in your questions as we go along here, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Pat, our first viewer, makes the point and raises the question, something similar that I was thinking, in fact. Obviously, candidates are spending more on digital advertising. Do you see a continued reliance on local stations in the future? Or, as I was thinking about it, another way of saying that, do you think broadcast TV will maintain its majority market share? Or do you see that mix shifting?
So I think that you're going to see the pie continue to grow, candidly. And I think spending in spot television is always going to have the lion's share. I think you'll see digital grow. I don't think there's any question around that or question about that. But I think that, the pie is going to continue to grow, and I think broadcasters will hold, share somewhere not far from where they ended up in this cycle, which is around 50%.
Okay, and another question here. Are close races a boon to local broadcasters, as in Georgia?
Oh, absolutely. When there's contested races, you end up seeing more money spent, and with half of that money going to broadcasters, it's a tremendous benefit.
One thing that surprised me in your pie chart, I think, was that it looked like cable had a relatively small share, 14%, plus you added satellite in for 15%. But when you consider that they've got the big news networks, like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, I would have thought maybe their share might have been higher.
So I believe that the numbers we're looking at there are local numbers. So if I believe so, if you took an individual market like Atlanta, the spending on local cable is a little bit lower than it would be on a national basis. So and it's because of limited reach in some markets. So broadcasters have greater reach, although cable does have some targeting capabilities that other media don't have. So again, I think in these political races, they're looking for broad reach and a medium that can produce results.
Pat, you talked about the Bloomberg effect, which is primarily a lot of money being poured into political ad spending. You mentioned what I would call the pandemic effect, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. You said that since campaigns couldn't do door-to-door canvassing and things like that, they turned to broadcast. So why do you think broadcast TV was the beneficiary of that pandemic shift more so than maybe digital?
Well, so I think digital probably benefited as well. I would suspect that all media benefited to some degree. As this impacted the Trump campaign in a very significant way, because he, at the end he was doing rallies, but you could see him out there all summer long, and they weren't able to do that. So I think broadcast television benefited just because we have the largest piece of the pie, but my guess would be that other media benefited from that phenomena as well.
Okay. Questions from one of our media trade reporters, Monty Taylor. And maybe you've covered this, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. Was this huge surge a unique event, or do you expect these records to be broken in 2024?
I would guess that these records will be broken in 2024, given the continued sort of competitiveness in the makeup in the makeup of the Senate and in the makeup of the House. If President Trump runs in 2024, there will be a lot of energy for him, and there'll be a lot of energy against him. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you we're going to grossly exceed the numbers we saw in 20 because they're stunningly high. But if I had to guess, I'd say we'd exceed those numbers.
Let me ask one question looking backward, and then we have a couple more questions looking ahead. You mentioned how the advertising started significantly earlier this year.
Yes.
You think that part of that might have been driven by the increase in mail-in voting and the fact that the election was actually going on a lot earlier in many places?
They started, so they really, so if you look at the Collins race in Maine, starting 15 months before the election, I honestly don't think that was motivated by mail-in voting. I think it was just, hey, we need to get started. We need to get our message out. And now there may have been, but the reality is, let's see, so COVID hit roughly, 8 months before the election day. There may have been some COVID-related increases there due to the expected high volume of mail-in voting, but in other races it was strictly, competitive advantage concerns.
Okay, a couple questions from our viewers looking ahead. How does ATSC 3.0 potentially change the conversation in 2024? And related to that, do you think that advertisers, including political advertisers, will use new next-gen TV features, such as clicking to donate or something similar?
Yeah. So I think it can have a significant effect. I mean, ultimately, if there was a scenario where every market would be rolled out by 2024, which is, I would tell you, a little bit unlikely, but there will be a large number of markets that will be lit up by 2024. There's a number today. What next gen or 3.0 offers is better targeting, and then there's also click to donate types of functions that political advertisers could utilize. So I think there will be markets where ATSC will matter in 2024. Again, there's still work to be done, but over a 4-year window, I think you're going to see that become a factor by 24.
And a question from our friend Gary Arlen: what is Gray's commitment to next gen TV? How many stations are you converting to ATSC 3.0? And what's your outlook for new digital services on 3.0?
Sure. So the way the 3.0 rollout is evolving, we're starting in larger markets. And so because Gray doesn't operate in a lot of larger markets, we're in Charlotte and Cleveland. So those would be the first two that we would roll out, and they're on the docket, I believe. I know Charlotte is for 21. Our markets, the majority of our markets will come a little later, but I would tell you that we're fully committed to 3.0 as a company. It's the future of our industry. It will give us competitive advantages that we've never had before, and we're very excited to have it roll out.
Okay. Well, Pat, I think that wraps it up here. And just want to thank you for a really interesting presentation, and thanks to our viewers for these great questions. Pat, thank you, and best of luck with Gray and everything you've got going on there. And we really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us here today.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure. We'll see you, Rick.
And thanks to our sponsors once again. Great to have you with us. And special thanks to Dave Arland of Arland Communications and John Taylor of LG Electronics. And we'll see you back here on December 15th for our virtual communications forum luncheon with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. So thank you once again for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you to our special guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band. And thank you again to our sponsors. See you next month.